The first PI job I ever worked was for a firm down in my native South Carolina, back from 2021 to 2022. It was a small outfit, not the most professional either, but it made for a good setting of training wheels so I could learn the tricks of the trade before moving on to bigger and better things. I guess that might make me sound kind of bitter or resentful, and you wouldn't be wrong about that. But if you were treated like I was treated after only my third solo assignment, I think some of y'all might feel a little unfairly treated as well. So, back around the holidays of 2021, I was given that third assignment, and since I was still a greenhorn, it was a simple one. A lady called saying her husband was lying to her, and that when he said he was going out drinking with friends, he was never at any of the bars that he said he was headed to. She wanted to know if he was cheating or not. She just couldn't bring herself to actually follow him anywhere, because seeing it happen would break her heart way worse than just knowing it was happening for certain. I guess you might not be surprised at how many jobs we get like that. Some outfits specialize in them, saying lust and mistrust keep the lights on around their places. It's a sad fact, but it's a sad world, and in our business, there wasn't much room for happy endings. Since it was a pretty basic job of following this lady's husband around, it was given to me. Covert surveillance was one of the few things that I felt that I was good at, so I was pretty confident going into the job that I'd find out what this guy was up to, and all without him realizing that I was following him. I was given the guy's address, a photograph of him, and a photograph of his car, too. And then after reading through a little background info on the case, I was good to go. The first night, I tailed the guy, who I'll just call Mark, because that's what he was. He drove over to a friend's house after telling his wife that's where he would be. A little anticlimactic, but I kept it up, and sure enough, one night he told her he was going out to a bar to watch the football highlights with his buddies, and he headed in the total opposite direction. No, I knew it was game on at this point, so to speak, so I kept a wider distance than usual, kept up the tail, and then followed him to this sort of patch of woods about a mile or so out of town. When he turned his car into what looked like a small rest area, I saw him pull up alongside another as I rolled past, making it look like I was headed to wherever I was going. But then the first chance I got, I pulled my car over and ran back to where he was parked to watch him from a dark patch of trees. Now Mark, who I'm also calling Mark to protect the identity of his wife, was talking with who I'm guessing was the owner of the other car. At first, I was thinking Mark was a closet case, that he was actually conducting an extramarital affair with another man. I wasn't excited about walking up on him and another woman, and without trying to sound like I hate gays, I don't. I was even less excited about the idea of walking up on him and another dude. But since I had to confirm that he was cheating and not just report back on where he was going, I had no choice. And so I watched Mark and his buddy for a few minutes while they did nothing but talk, before they suddenly walked over to the other guy's trunk and he opened it up. I got this sinking feeling, thinking it was another dud, and all Mark was there to do was buy a second-hand pair of jumper cables or something. So imagine my surprise when he and his buddy slid a couple of ski masks over their heads before the buddy took what looked like a couple of hammers or hatchets from the trunk and handed one to Mark. I didn't have any kind of camera, let alone one with any night vision capabilities, so there was no recording either of them as they walked off into the trees. And before anyone reading this starts thinking, why not just use your phone? Well, that wasn't an option. It was almost pitch black, and the light coming from inside the open car would have done nothing but silhouette them if I tried to take a picture without a flash. I could barely see what they were holding in their hands, and that's why I said either hammers or hatchets. And then after Mark's buddy locked up his car and the dome light went off, there was no seeing them at all. So while I had a good idea that they were up to no good, I needed to follow if I wanted to know what it was, but you can bet your ass that I kept my distance. I must have given it maybe 10 to 15 seconds, and then I crossed the road, past Mark and his buddy's car, and then followed them off into the darkness. The trees were fairly spaced out, and there was just enough moonlight for us to not need any flashlights, which was good, but also bad because it meant at some points I had to tail Mark and the company by sound alone. They were keeping their voices down, but not whispering or anything like that. And their footsteps were so loud that I could keep an easy track of them. But then after only a few minutes of walking, they stopped, exchanged a few even quieter words, and then went silent altogether as they started creeping through the darkness. I realized then that I could see the glow of a campfire in the distance, and that Mark and his buddy were headed right for it. Now, I rightly figured that whoever the campfire belonged to, Mark and his buddy were either headed out to meet them or sneaking out there to attack them, and from the way they were doing just that, sneaking, I was right in assuming it was the second one. And then almost seconds later, not after they disappeared into the darkness completely, I heard someone yelling over near the campfire, and then the yelling turned to screaming. When I heard the screaming, it was like the math started mathing in my head all of a sudden, and I realized exactly what Mark and his friend were doing. You see, there's been a spate of really horrible attacks perpetrated on the town's homeless community who live just outside the limits in a bunch of woodland camps, real end-of-the-world type stuff. Some were causing trouble, I can't deny that, but when someone started heading out to their camps at night and beating them half to death, they weren't discriminating based on who was and who wasn't stealing from stores or trying to rob cars. They beat anyone, and it was kind of a miracle someone hadn't been killed already. It was only then that I took out my phone, and even then it wasn't to get any pictures. I couldn't. But what I did do was record the sound of some of those screams just so I could prove that I hadn't made the whole thing up. I know it was unlikely that people would think that I'd made anything up, but it sure helps to have a shred of proof sometimes, and this time was no different. I also ended up doing the thing that I said I wouldn't, taking pictures of the car's 2 license plates after making my way back the way I came. Then the next morning, before I contacted the client about what I'd found, I contacted the cops and told them everything. It made for one hell of a call to the client, telling her that there was a good chance her husband might be arrested that day, and then when she asked why, I told her what I'd found. She was so horrified that she just hung up. I thought we'd have to chase her to pay the rest of the invoice. She paid a few days later, I'm guessing after she'd processed the arrest and charges. And the whole thing turned into a big story, and I think a total of 4 local men were arrested for organizing violent raids against the homeless camps. It was easily one of the most messed up cases I've ever worked on for any of the firms or companies I've worked for. And before I left for pastures new, we ended up getting a letter from the guy's wife thanking us for uncovering her husband's dark secret. We get paid pretty good, and that's just about the one thing I can't complain about. But getting thank you letters from folks and hearing how grateful they are is just about the only other thing about this job that makes it all worth it. I had an old friend who used to be a cop, but he had to medically retire at 36 after some a-hole almost blew his legs off. So he was just an ununiformed cop, driving around the city responding to calls. Then one day, he gets one about a guy acting very weird who was threatening to shoot people as they walk past his home. He rolls up on the house to find one of the neighbors across the street taking cover behind his car, pointing at the suspect's house and yelling, He just ran back inside. He says he's going to start shooting from the windows." My buddy runs towards this guy's open front door, trying to corner the guy and not make himself a sitting duck out there. But then, as he walked into his house, bam, the guy fires up through his floorboards from the basement. He'd stripped away some of the paneling underneath, so my friend basically walked into this guy's trap. And while he avoided having to have anything amputated, the doctor said he was real lucky that wasn't the case. Now, he goes through all the recovery and rehab, and the department said that they'd assess him at the end of it and see if he was still okay to do his job. But my buddy said that he knew early on that he'd end up getting disability, as they call it, when you're no longer fit to be a cop anymore, usually after getting hurt while you're on the clock. He got given all that sweet, sweet disability money, and I know guys that would have just played golf and worked on their cars for the rest of their days. But my old buddy there, he wasn't that kind of guy. Still isn't, actually. He still wants to run around chasing bad guys and investigating things, so it was just his luck that all his experience as a police officer meant a high-paying job as a private investigator. But his troubles didn't end there. He thought it was going to be all easy and boring, but he didn't care because boring meant safe. His boss warned him things could get pretty dark sometimes and he could handle the dark. At least, he thought so anyway. He ends up getting a case involving possibly infidelity, where the client was a guy who thought his wife might be cheating on him with someone she worked with. Now, my friend said that he seemed like a normal guy. Upset, but kind of resigned to it. He pretty much knew his wife was cheating. He just needed proof so his divorce attorneys could make it a quick and relatively cheap process. And that's where my buddy came in. He tails the lady morning until night, finding out that she really is cheating, and then after getting a bunch of photographs of them meeting up and smooching and all of that, he presents all of his photos and notes to the client. He said that again, during the second meeting, nothing about the client's behavior made him suspicious or suggested what he was about to do. All he did was talk about attorney's fees and what the judge had to say about it. He seemed relieved in a lot of ways, and my buddy said he actually managed to crack a smile when they shook hands as he was leaving. Then a week later, he sees the guy's face in the newspaper. My buddy never told me either of their names, said he couldn't bring himself to say them out loud. But the man who'd acted so calm and mild-mannered in front of my buddy had actually gone home, drove out to where his wife was staying, more info my friend gave him, and then shot her 6 times as she was walking out to her car one day. The wife survived somehow, but ended up in one of those big old motorized wheelchairs, completely paralyzed and blowing into a tube to make herself go forward. The guy ended up going to prison for a hell of a long time, too. And I mean, the whole thing just sounded awful. The couple had a high school-age kid, and what happened messed her up so much that she ended up dying in a car accident while driving drunk one night, like the whole family was cursed. And while his mind managed to survive the guy shooting his wife, hearing about the kid passing in the accident caused my friend to feel a whole lot of guilt. So much guilt, in fact, that he ended up having a complete mental breakdown from all the guilt he was feeling. He quit being a private investigator and then took a job as a consultant for an insurance company, because I guess after being a part of someone's murder, overseeing a few rises in premiums doesn't make a dent. I've joked about that with him, after waiting for the right time, of course, because if there's one thing I know about cops, it's that they all got that dark sense of humor about things. He did a lot of therapy to help him deal with the guilt, and he changed his mind about who the blame really lies with in the death of that poor woman, but he's always stood firm about the realities of being a private investigator. When you're a cop, you work for the government, be it state or federal, local. But when you work privately, you work for anybody who's got the money, and then there's no telling what they're going to do with the info you provide them. Now, his boss said that that was the nature of the beast, and that a lot of his high-roller clients were business executives trying to get dirt on each other, either for blackmail or to leak business associates so that a certain person didn't get that promotion that they had their eye on. And then there were the guys, like the one my friend dealt with, who only wanted to know where someone was so they could do them harm. They'd come in acting all upset or worried and then tell the PIs that they were worried about their wives or daughters. Some guys refused the case if they got a bad vibe, but some of these guys would go off looking for them anyway, knowing that it'd have a bad ending, but not giving a crap because the money was right. That's why my buddy stayed out after he got out, because no matter how good the money is, it's just not worth the guilt. In Imperial-era St. Petersburg, unease gathered around a reclusive old woman said to live on the city's fringes. Neighbors spoke of strange habits, of doors kept shut and movements glimpsed only at odd hours. In time, rumors twisted her into something more than human, echoing the old Slavic fear of Baba Yaga. Whether she was simply a woman or something darker was never truly settled, and the story lingered as a quiet warning in the cold northern streets. Listen to the full story over on my true crime channel, Saturn Soul, link down below. My name's James, I'm from Colorado, and my late father was a police officer here for 25 years. He ended up writing a book about it, which includes chapters about the PI work that he did after boredom had him temporarily coming out of retirement for a few years. The book was never published, and I only got a chance to read it after he'd passed away, and I received all this stuff in boxes. But some of the stories from his cop days are wild. Yet, it's not one of those that I'm sending your way today. It's from his days as a private investigator back in the late 80s when Dad was still in his 50s. Because to me, it's not just the scariest story he put to paper, it's one of the weirdest and creepiest stories I've ever heard anywhere. And so here it is, and the following story is told from Dad's perspective. Chapter 19, 777. By 1984, I was working out of Denver with a guy named Steve Hayway. Now, it was a lot of the same crap, different day, but every so often, because of our reputations as former cops, we get a real doozy landing on our desks. We got a call from a man looking for his brother who'd vanished just over a year ago. The brother, a guy named Joseph, had been a quiet, hard-working family man for the majority of his adult life. But then in the spring of 1983, he just up and walked out of his whole life one day, right out of the blue. The only thing he left was a note, scrawled in pencil like he was mad when he wrote it, saying, "Sell the house!" ! Sell the kids. I'm not coming back. Now, since no one knew for sure who the note's true author was, and since Joe's behavior was so incredibly unusual, 2 agents from the state's missing persons unit spent 2 weeks looking for him all over the state. When they found him living down in Bent County, near a place called Los Animas, he very angrily told them to leave, saying that he was done with his old life and was never going back to it. There obviously wasn't much the cops could do, so Joe's brother drove out there as soon as he could. But when he arrived, Joe was packed up and gone. Now, by the time he became a client, it had been almost a full year since he and Joe last spoke, and he was willing to pay top dollar to know if Joe was alive, and if so, what condition he was in. I volunteered to work the case alone because to me, it made no sense to have both me and Stevie head out on some wild goose chase. Now, I know that might sound cruel, but it's just about as accurate a description as I can manage. Joe was a wild goose. He didn't want to be found, meaning that he could have been just about anywhere, having long since departed the state of Colorado. The only leads that we had were his presence around Los Animas and a storage container full of his stuff. So having learned what kind of man he was, I drove down to Bent County to try and get a sense of the man that Joe had become. Los Animas is a small town in the southern plain, and if the legends are to be believed, it was named after a group of doomed conquistadors who died without receiving the last rites. As a result, their souls were doomed to remain in purgatory, leading the Spanish to give the place the full title of the City of Lost Souls. Neither me nor Joe's brother believed the town's name had anything to do with his decision to move there, but it still made for one heck of a fitting name for a man who seemed to have, for lack of a better term, lost his soul. Joe used to be kind, patient, and loving, and made time for his wife and kids too. And then one day, that all changed, and it was like he became a completely different person. But why? I believed at least some of the answer to that question laid down in Los Animas. And so one day, in the summer of 1984, I began the long and tiring process of canvassing public places in the hopes that someone knew where Joe had gone. I started at grocery stores, since those are the one thing that everyone needs, and then when I had no luck there, I tried the bars. Now, they're a great place to look for a certain kind of person because they'll sit there for hours, sometimes all night, and bartenders are good with faces. I visited the one closest to where Joe had apparently been staying, but no one there recognized him. And then stopping by another with similar results, I started to worry that no one in Los Animas would recognize Joe at all. But then, At a place called Pete's Fan Zone, I had my first encounter with Lady Luck. It was early afternoon, not long after opening time, and an old-timer with the shakes was sitting at the bar while the bartender was still getting things all set up. I introduced myself as a private investigator from Denver and then showed him Joe's photograph. The bartender then looked at me with this very serious look on his face and asked, "What'd he do?" Now, it turned out Joe had made a few visits in 1983 during the same period that he was thought to have been missing. Then when I asked the bartender if he'd seen him since, he said yes, that he'd come back in late April of 1984. The bartender said he barely recognized Joe at first. The guy who'd walked through the door almost a year prior had been somewhat well-groomed and had some meat on his bones, whereas the guy who walked in on that day had shoulder-length hair, a fist-sized beard, and looked like he'd lost about 50 pounds. He said he only recognized him by his voice and the brand of beer he ordered, but rather than ask too many questions, he just gave him his beer and change and then left him to sit alone in his booth. Now, about an hour goes by and the bartender assumes Joe's there to think and drink alone, as usual. But then, some creepy-looking guy walks in, skinny as a rake with alopecia, like a walking literal skeleton, and he sits down in front of Joe before the two start talking. The bartender said he was planning on giving them about 10 minutes before he'd walk over and tell that walking skeleton he either needed to buy a drink or leave. But before things came to that, the pair of them just got up and walked out together. Now, I asked the bartender if he happened to overhear anything that was said. He hadn't, but said one of them threw a napkin into a finished glass of beer before they left. He had to scoop the thing out to wash the glass, but before tossing it in the trash, he saw something was written on it. There were two names, neither of which he could remember, but he could remember the number that had been written above them in much larger lettering. It read 777. Now, I started to think that it might have been gambling related, but it had to quickly rule that theory out as Joe hadn't so much as touched the joint savings account that he shared with his wife. Whatever he was doing with himself, he didn't need much money to do it, and that obviously made finding him very difficult. And that lead that I got at the Los Animas bar was also just one of the two that I got while I was in town. One was the bartender, the other was Pastor Ed over at the town's Calvary Church. And when I showed him Joe's picture, Pastor Ed told me that he was pretty certain that Joe had wanted to kill him one night. Joe had been a church-going man, at least before he disappeared, which was why I thought shopping by the town's churches might be productive, and it was. Pastor Ed said that he hadn't seen Joe at any of his services. He didn't know that he was even in town until he spotted him while taking his trash out one night back in the spring of 1983. Now, he didn't see Joe at first. He just got himself a little scared when he realized someone was lurking in the shadows nearby. And then when Joe started to approach, Pastor Ed saw the large, mostly empty whiskey bottles in his hands, and the way he was looking at Pastor Ed scared the living hell out of him. Pastor Ed said that as Joe turned the bottle in his hand so he was holding it like a club, he started backing away slowly. He said the bottle was shaking in Joe's grip, and that no matter how hard he tried to calm him down, he just stood there, looking like he was about to launch himself at that pastor until he finally seemed to regain his senses. Pastor Ed said he turned and walked off, clearly in some kind of distress, but he didn't stick around. He wanted to get the guy help, but he knew any attempt to do so would almost certainly get him hurt. Now, it was also the desire to help which stopped him from calling the police, and instead, he just sat out on his porch for a while, waiting to see if Joe would return. Now, he never did see Joe at one of his services, never saw him again, in fact, and while his stories certainly shed light on Joe's mental state in the months after he left his home, it only seemed to deepen the mystery. Because of all the people he could have picked, why Pastor Ed? Now, once I was certain Joe was no longer in Los Animas, I drove back to Denver to talk to his brother again. He had a key for a storage container full of Joe's old stuff, all the thing his wife boxed up when she couldn't stand to look at them anymore. He didn't think that there was anything in there worth opening it up for, but I figured that I'd better take a look, just in case. The client was right in a sense. The vast majority of stuff that was in there were either clothes or books. There were no journals, photographs, or postcards of places he might have once visited. Just a whole bunch of shirts and pants and a whole bunch of novels with a handful of other stuff mixed in there, including about half a dozen books on classical Arabic. Almost everything from his office and the garage was in there too, including the contents of a trash can contained in a trash bag. Now, there was all kinds of junk in there, but nothing but a small leather-bound notebook caught my eye, one that appeared to have been partially burned. I pulled it out and dusted it off, but found that next to none of its contents were readable. Almost every page had been blackened or burned away entirely, but it also looked as if someone had gone to great lengths to ensure only the pages burned. At the time, I thought that maybe someone had regretted setting the pages on fire, and if whatever was in there was so precious they tried to douse the flames, I figured it was worth taking a look at. Now, some might consider that a strange sort of inkling to have, to be sifting through trash when I could be out there putting up missing posters and the like, but if there's one thing being an investigator of any kind teaches you, it's to leave no stone unturned. And on this occasion, turning over that half-burned stone paid off massively. Firstly, I was able to determine that Joe had been using the notebook to translate something. There were no religious texts or anything in his possession, so I doubted it was anything of that nature, but whatever was being translated, it was significant enough that someone had tried to destroy it. I'd first hoped that it'd provide some insight into Joe's state of mind, giving me a clue as to where he might be and what he might be doing, but it did so much more than that, because on the back inside cover, the number 777 had been written, and underneath in smaller letters were the two names the bartender down in Los Animas couldn't recall. And those names were Mumford Scott and Meeker Martinez. The first thing I did after finding the notebook was ask the client about his brother's interest in the Arabic language, particularly its classical or pre-Islamic roots. Now, he said he didn't even know Joe was learning another language until months after he started, after an incident in a Lebanese restaurant where Joe thanked a waiter in Arabic. The client said he asked Joe to show off more of his Arabic, but Joe rather meekly explained that the type he was learning wasn't the conversational kind, and to put it simply, it was like Joe was learning Shakespearean English. It sounded great, but the average person on the street in any Arabic-speaking country might not completely understand what the heck he's saying. Now, he was also buying all of these old books, all written in classical Arabic, and working on his own translations of them. The client said a couple of them looked ornately decorated and that Joe seemed embarrassed of the amounts that he spent on them. The client hadn't thought much of this at the time, only that his brother had picked up a new and rather unusual hobby. I myself didn't immediately suspect it of being a symptom or even contributing to Joe's strange new behaviors, because what I really wanted to know was, who the hell was Mumford Scott and Meeker Martinez? The client had no idea. He'd never heard those two names in his life before, but he couldn't rule out them being associates of his brother. Now, some preliminary research of the name Mumford Scott revealed that, assuming Joe had misspelled the name Munford, it might refer to a 16th century Catholic martyr who was executed by the English for the crime of practicing his faith. Catholics were often burned at the stake back then, which made me think that his name and the burned book were somehow connected. But it wasn't Latin he was translating, it was Arabic, and despite him being a church-going man, there were no books in the collection pertaining to Catholicism or Catholic martyrs. Now, I had even less luck with the name Meeker Martinez. It wasn't in any phone books, and there was no notable people with that same name. And even so, I made a note of both, just in case I encountered them in the future. But what I had worked out is that one of the few things Joe had taken with him when he disappeared was his collection of old, rare books. Since they mattered to him that much, I thought that it'd be a good idea to contact rare book dealers around Denver, as well as the wider area, to see if Joe had done any business with them. I ticked off all the major players in the Denver area and then ticked off those in the surrounding states, and I even contacted a group of more specialist dealers as in those who dealt in pre-Islamic Arabic texts, but was told that not only had they never done business with a Joe, but the prices on some of the older and rarer texts could reach up to 30 grand. It was little wonder his books were so precious to him, and I started to wonder if they were a little more relevant to the case than I first thought, as in, were his attempts at translating them just a symptom of whatever he was going through? Or were they the cause? Like I said, I had no luck with any of the rare book dealers I contacted, and it was then that the investigation started to slow. I resorted to contacting churches, as well as some of my old cop buddies, to find out if there had been any similar encounters between Joe and members of the clergy, but again, I had no luck. This is all pre-internet too, so there was no looking somebody up online, and if you wanted to look someone's criminal history up, you had to wait weeks after a phone call to get a letter in the mail. I tried that too, by the way, and once again had no luck. But it was during that barren period that I realized something about the number 777. To cover all my bases and in the hopes of sparking a breakthrough, I rented a library book on pre-Islamic calligraphy and scripture. I only got one thing out of it, but it was easily the most unsettling discovery I'd made thus far. There was always something that bothered me about the way Joe had written the number 777 on the inside of his book. Now, the top line on the sevens looked almost curved, but since people quite often have unusual quirks in their handwriting, I didn't understand the significance right away. But while reading through the book, I came across a section on Arabic numbers. It turns out they've had a huge influence on the numbers we still use today. Their small circle 0 is basically a precursor to our own oval-shaped character, and their characters for 1 and 9 are almost identical to the ones we use today. Their number 5 is kind of like a U, and then their number 7 comes in a V shape, but their 6s look almost exactly like our 7s. And not only that, but they have that same curved top line to them, just like Joe's 7s seem to have on his burned notebook. Now, I'm willing to bet the 7s on the bartender's napkin looked the exact same way, but regardless, it made me realize something. Joe wasn't writing 777. He was using the Arabic numbers. What he was really writing was 666. This obviously added a whole new dimension to the case, as it was now entirely possible that Joe was actually suffering some kind of religious mania. Now, it also lined up with his intimidating encounter with Pastor Ed down in Los Animas, because if he was angry at the church in some tangible or more abstract sense, it stood to reason that he might get drunk and consider assaulting a pastor. But why? What the hell had gone so wrong in his life that he felt the need to do something so awful? Now, a lot of the time, it's a psychological issue, and there ain't no rhyme or reason to it whatsoever. But from where I was standing at the time, there might not have been any obvious reason, but the whole thing had this dark rhyme to it, like I was slowly but surely uncovering something much darker than I'd first anticipated. Like I said, the investigation had just about ground to a halt by the time I came to the 777 revelation. I tried courthouses, DMVs, the national white pages. I even tried one of those old-fashioned crisscross directories, which allow me to get in touch with Joe's old neighbors down in Los Animas, but no one had seen or heard of him. He didn't need to leave the U.S. to go off the grid, but it still felt like there was a chance that he'd left the country entirely. Those religious fixations sometimes end up in Rome or Israel or even further afield, and then the missing show back up on their loved one's doorstep in Hare Krishna Orange and having changed their names to Rajneesh or something. A true story, by the way, and a case that I worked on personally, so possibility was still on my mind when, on a sunny Sunday afternoon, I got a call from my brother up in Greeley. Now, he had a grandson who was about to start elementary school, and then since it was a Sunday, my niece and his son-in-law were over with the two kids, and they'd been complaining about trying to get their eldest into this one particular school. My brother's passing all this on while sitting in his armchair, mostly to get a rest from all that grandchild energy that was probably making his head spin. And then he suddenly mentions the name of one of the schools, Scott Elementary. It was the school they didn't want their kid going to, and having recently done so much reading on the martyred Munford, I'd be lying if I said my ears didn't prick right up. Now, my brother said something about how below standard it was and how my niece wanted her son going to a much nicer school in their district. Now, I guess someone was walking by at the time because he suddenly spoke off the handset saying, "What was the name of that other school, sweetie?" And then he brought the handset to his mouth again and said, Meeker. Meeker Elementary. You heard of it? Susie says it's top in the state. If hearing Scott picked up my ears, hearing Meeker had full-on alarm bells going off in my head. There was only one place that I'd ever heard or seen that name in my life before, and it was on the inside cover of Joe's burned-up notebook. I asked my brother if he was absolutely positively certain that he'd gotten those two names right, Scott and Meeker Elementary Schools. And then after he double-checked and told me the names were correct, I told him I had to go, but that I might just call him back again to ask a favor. He asked if it was a work thing, and I said yes, and he said, "Well, all right then," and then I hung up the phone. I kept a detailed road map of Colorado in my office, one of those that's broken down into a book with pages so you can see all that detail without having to fold the thing out. I found Greenlee, found my brother's house, and then looked around until I found Meeker Elementary. Scott Elementary was close by, and then after searching the wider area, I felt my heart begin to race as I suddenly spotted a Munford Elementary, and then seconds later, a Martinez Elementary School. Either this was the biggest coincidence I'd ever encountered or even heard of, or the names Joe wrote down weren't the names of people. They were the names of 4 elementary schools in the city of Greeley, Colorado. I called my brother right back and asked if he minded me sleeping in his spare room that following night. I might not need to, but if I even got so much of a whiff that Joe was in Greeley, then it was better to have somewhere local that I could lay my head rather than have to drive an hour each way to commute. The next morning, I was up in Greeley, and the first place that I stopped was Meeker Elementary, just minutes away from my niece's place. I parked my car, got out, and took a look around to see that there was no sign of Joe anywhere. Not that I expected there would be, but as I walked around the block, I spotted something which made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. Spray painted on the side of the school, with a janitor actually in the process of scrubbing it off with some soap and a wire brush, was what appeared to be the number 777, but what I now know meant 666. I then raced over to Scott Elementary, where I found the same graffiti on a wall near the parking lot. It was the same story as Martinez and Munford too, and I just knew that either Joe or the associate that he meant in Los Animas Bar had something to do with it. Now, the first thing I did was call the local police department, and after making it clear that I was a former cop, I told them some of Joe's story and why I believed the children at all 4 elementary schools could be in danger. The deputy I spoke to seemed only too happy to take a description of Joe, but when I tried to convince him of the number 777's significance, I could tell I was losing him a little. He said they'd been dealing with 777 graffiti all over town for weeks by that point, and they were confident that it was affiliated with some kind of up-and-coming local gang who were targeting schools as a sort of recruitment method. I tried convincing him that the number had some kind of religious, maybe even satanic significance, and that the graffiti might have been sprayed by a man who'd already almost attacked a priest down in Los Animas. I don't blame the officer for having the reaction he did. What I was saying would have sure as hell sounded crazy to me, back when I was just a uniformed desk jockey. So when I told him it might be a good idea to evacuate the schools and keep them empty until Joe had been found, he told me that probably wasn't going to happen. And by probably, he meant definitely wasn't going to happen. He assured me all the town's schools had robust safety measures and could liaise with city law enforcement in the event that some crazy guy tried to gain access. He wasn't dismissive at all, almost like he wanted to reassure me that I had nothing to worry about. But as you can probably imagine, nothing he said did anything to reassure me. Either Joe or one of his mysterious affiliates was almost certainly in town, and while I didn't know exactly what they were planning, the fact that they were targeting elementary schools gave me a terrible feeling in the pit of my stomach. I did my usual thing of stopping by any churches I could find to ask if they had any sort of strange or frightening encounters with anyone, but none had. And I also stopped by an old antique store that they had in town, which just so happened to have a sizable cache of old books. but the owner had no recollection of anyone asking for old Arabic texts or of anyone stopping by who fit Joe's description. I ended up staying with my brother that night, but while he was kind enough to let me sleep in his spare room on that old, big, comfy mattress that he had in there, I don't think I slept for more than a couple of hours. I remember the one dream that woke me up startled, how the schools were on fire, and how no matter how much the fire department tried to hose them down and douse the flames, little kids kept on bursting from the doors in flames and running around like little torches, and no one could put them out. Around 6:30 in the morning, I decided it was useless to try and get back to sleep, so I got up, took a shower and got dressed, and then drove into town to find somewhere to have breakfast. It was a Friday morning and the place was pretty busy, so I had to park my car a block away and walk to the diner. I spent about an hour and a half sitting at the table taking advantage of the free coffee refills while poring over my notes regarding the case. Sometimes just ruminating on a subject helps with a breakthrough, and sometimes not, and unfortunately on this occasion, I left the diner with nothing but that bad feeling in my stomach, telling me something was going to happen that day. I thought about calling the cops again, of doing everything shy of demanding that they close the schools for the day, but I knew that I'd just sound twice as crazy as I did the day before. And all I had was my hunch, and no matter how long I worked as a cop or how big it was, a hunch was still just a hunch. Now, it must have been about 8:30 in the morning by the time I started walking back to my car, and with every step, I was trying to put myself in Joe's shoes. If I'm in town, am I in a motel, or am I sleeping in a car or out under a bush someplace because I don't want to be found? Did I mark those schools out for some kind of attack, or had I deluded myself into thinking that I put some kind of magical spell on them? That's if Joe was even still there and he hadn't just packed up and moved on like he'd done back in Los Animas. Now, I was just chasing shadows, or was I really onto something? Now, all that's going through my head as I'm walking, and then as I'm only about maybe 20 or 30 feet away from my car, a man walks around a corner in front of me and starts walking in my direction. He's tall, skinny, with long hair and a long beard, and has a ball cap on with the peak pulled low. Now, I wasn't obvious about it, but I tracked a little closer to him, hoping to catch a glimpse of his face as he passed me. I remember scolding myself a little, thinking that the case was getting to me and I was about to initiate a confrontation with a completely unrelated homeless guy. But as he passed me, I recognized him in an instant. The majority of his face might have been covered by all that hair, but I'd been looking at pictures of that man for weeks by that point, so there was something about his nose and eyes that clicked with me immediately. It was Joseph, the client's missing brother, and he just walked right past me. At first, I was too stunned to even say anything. I'd been scouring the state of Colorado for that guy for a month, and then there he goes walking past me one sunny Friday morning, like I hadn't spent the last 3.5 weeks fixating on his whole damned existence. Now, I didn't want to spook him right away, so I just called out, "Sir," in a polite voice. He didn't stop. I'm guessing on the assumption or hope that my call wasn't directed at him. But as I began to follow him, I called out a second time. On that occasion, he stopped and turned. I asked if his name was Joe, but he said nothing in reply. Then, to try and earn at least a thread of trust and understanding, I told him I was there on behalf of his brother, our client. That prompted a flash of recognition in his eyes, but still he didn't say anything, and he waited until I'd finished a short explanation on why I was looking for him before asking, "Are you a Fed?" Now, I had already touched on the fact that I was just a PI, but after feeling somewhat taken aback by that question, I reiterated that I was not there in a law enforcement capacity. Joe listened, but there wasn't the same flash of recognition. He just stared at me, almost like he wasn't really listening anymore. It was then that I fulfilled his brother's request that I invite him to make a phone call, just so he could hear his voice as a kind of proof of life. But Joe didn't seem too excited on that idea at all. He repeated the question back to me, asking if I wanted him to go with him. And that's what I mean when I say it was almost like he wasn't listening and that his mind must have been elsewhere. He was only giving me half of his attention, and he made that evident by looking around as if I might have backup or something close by. I repeated that yes, I wanted him to come with me at the request of his brother, but seeing as I wasn't a cop or agent or anything, he could just simply refuse and walk away. But I didn't get past the cop part because as soon as I said it, Joe pulled a gun and fired at me 3 times. I wasn't defenseless. I had a concealed carry permit for the state of Colorado, and when Joe reached like he did, I knew he was going for a gun, and so I went for mine too. Sadly, he beat me to it, on account of him having the jump on me though, not because of my age, and I was still fast enough to put one of my 3 shots into him, but he put 2 of his own into me. The first shot caught me as I tried to twist away from him, lodging its way against the bone in one of my arms. If it had punctured through, it might have got my lungs or some of the larger blood vessels in my chest, which would have been really bad news for me. The second shot hit me in the thigh, just above the knee, missing my femur and femoral artery by the width of a finger. I went down hard as Joe turned and ran, and that's when I fired my last shot, the one that hit him, but then I knew that I had to check my own wounds, as just seconds mean life and death if you have an arterial bleed. Now, luckily I didn't seem to have one. There was no spray, just a heavy seep from my arm and thigh. Now, I was also lucky that someone in a home close by had heard the shots, meaning an ambulance was on its way by the time that I was trying to tie a tourniquet around my leg using my own necktie. I was conscious when the paramedics arrived, and they worked fast to apply pressure dressings and an actual tourniquet. And then, after they drove me to the hospital, they put me under, and I went into the OR for surgery. I woke up in the recovery room with my arm strapped to my chest and my leg elevated, and I was still in pain, but at least by then I had the morphine to stave it off. I was told Joe had been arrested and was actually in the very same hospital that I was, recovering from surgery to remove the bullet from his hip. Only unlike me, Joe was handcuffed to his hospital bed. I later heard the cops searched his motel room and found 6 different firearms, big and small, 2 entire bags worth of ammunition to go with it all. Now, there weren't any floor plans of the schools or anything, so the cops failed to make some connection that I did when I heard about all those guns and all that ammo. So in the end, all they charged him with was attempted murder for what he did to me. I tried telling them to look at my notes because they might be able to pin a whole mess of conspiracy to murder charges on him, but in the end, it was easier to go for the sure shot than the Hail Mary. And my recovery took months. The doctors said that because of my age, my clavicle was knitting back together much slower than it would for a younger man. This meant that for a whole 6 weeks, I couldn't lift my left arm above shoulder height. Now, the nights were the worst because that's when the pain was the worst, but it wasn't just the pain pills that brought relief. It was the comfort of knowing what I'd stopped. I know what Joe was planning, but I'll never truly know why he was fixing to do something so terrible. I don't know if it was something that he read in that old book of his that made him want to do it, or if it was merely a symptom of a diseased mind. I just know that if I had to take those 2 bullets, so that all those kids didn't, it seems like a fair enough trade to me. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday and Thursday at 9 p.m. Eastern Time, and there are super fun live streams on Sundays and Wednesday nights. And if you got a story, be sure to submit them over at my email, LetsReadSubmissions@gmail.com, and you might even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks for members of the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories in long compilations located anywhere you listen to podcasts. I also have a true crime channel called Saturn Soul, new video out now every other Tuesday. All links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends. And remember, all giggles aside, I cherish and support you. Have a good week.